Good, within budget. Here's the final humanized script. A city that Ukraine retook in a single week back in September 2022 is once again at the center of a fight that maps can't quite agree on. According to the Institute for the Study of War's Russian Offensive Campaign Assessment dated May 27, 2026, Russian mechanized and infantry elements have renewed pressure toward Kupiansk, a rail and road hub in Kharkiv Oblast just west of the Oskil River. Why does one mid-sized city, population now a fraction of what it was before the full-scale invasion, keep showing up in these reports years after it was supposedly secured? That's what this video works through. Not speculation, but what ISW says it can confirm, what it flags as reported but unverified, and what the terrain around Kupiansk actually looks like right now. What this is really about is how analysts sort of battlefield claim from a battlefield fact. By the end, you should be able to make that call yourself next time a frontline update shows up in your feed. First, a word on what ISW actually is, since that shapes how much weight to put on anything it publishes. The Institute for the Study of War is a Washington-based think tank that has produced near-daily written assessments of the war in Ukraine since 2022, built from open-source material. Geolocated video and photography, Russian and Ukrainian military bloggers, statements from both governments, and satellite imagery where it's available. ESW is explicit that these are not intelligence products. They're a synthesis of public information, cross-checked against known terrain and unit patterns, updated as new footage or claims surface. That matters because every line in one of these reports carries an implicit confidence level, even when the prose doesn't spell it out. I spent a while digging into how SW actually builds its control of terrain maps, and one detail kept nagging at me. The maps are always a step behind the fighting, on purpose. A settlement doesn't change color the moment a unit walks in. It changes once there's geolocatable proof, a soldier's video with a matchable building facade, a recognizable road sign, a distinctive tree line. Until then, a place gets reported as contested by both sides at once, and ISW says exactly that instead of picking a winner. So what does the May 27th assessment actually say about Kupiansk? It documents renewed Russian, mechanized, and infantry activity pushing toward the city from the east and northeast, matching a pattern ISW had already tracked through the spring. Incremental infantry infiltration into contested settlements, then attempts to consolidate and bring in armor once a foothold holds. ISW's mapped positions for that date show Russian forces holding or contesting ground in a band of settlements outside Kupiansk's eastern approaches, with Ukrainian countermoves reported in at least one of those settlements within the following days. ISW doesn't call this a breakthrough. It calls it pressure, sustained, costly, and, as of that assessment, not yet enough to collapse the Ukrainian defensive line around the city itself. The real difficulty in reporting a front like this, honestly, is that verification lags reality, sometimes by days. A claim that a village has fallen can circulate on Russian military channels hours before any geolocated footage exists to confirm or deny it. Ukrainian sources, meanwhile, often report repelled assaults in the same spot, and both things can be true at different hours of the same day. ISW's way of handling that gap is to log the claim, mark it explicitly as reported rather than confirmed, and wait. It's a slower way to cover a war. It means this channel, like every honest outlet on this front, is sometimes a day or two behind the loudest voices on social media. I'd rather be slow and right. What surprised me most about this push wasn't the direction. Kupiansk has been a target of Russian operations, on and off, since Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive first pushed Russian forces out of the city in September 2022. What surprised me was how long the front around it has held roughly static, given the pressure ISW has documented in waves since late 2023. Kupiansk sits at a genuine choke point. It's a rail junction that has historically fed logistics in both directions along this stretch of the Oskil River line, and whoever holds it securely shortens their own supply routes. That's the strategic reason underneath the tactical reporting. This is an infrastructure target, not a symbolic one. The city itself is cut nearly in half by the Oskil, which is why fighting has periodically crept into its northern districts even while the broader front line sits a few kilometers out. ISW's May 27th assessment doesn't report the city itself as the site of urban combat that day. It reports pressure on the settlements ringing it, the ground Ukrainian forces need to hold to keep any Russian advance from reaching the city's edge at all. That distinction is easy to lose in headline-only coverage. Renewed push toward Kupiansk describes an approach, not an assault on the city proper, at least as of this assessment's date. This part is worth sitting with. Most coverage of a front like this defaults to one of two modes, treating every reported Russian gain as the start of a collapse, or treating every reported Ukrainian repel as proof the line is unbreakable. Neither framing survives contact with what these assessments actually show over time. A front that moves in meters, not kilometers, absorbs enormous resources on both sides for that movement, and it can reverse within the same week it advanced. If I have an unpopular opinion here, it's that the month-to-month noise around individual settlements matters less than most coverage implies. What matters is the multi-month trend line, and on that trend line, this axis has been a grind rather than a decisive shift in either direction for well over a year. What does that tell us about how this stage of the war functions? Fronts like Kupiansk are a reminder that offensive and defensive are relative terms in a war shaped like this one. A renewed push can consume weeks of preparation and still be measured, when it's over, in control of a handful of settlements. That's not a judgment on either side's capability. It's a description of what high-intensity, technology-saturated ground warfare looks like when both sides have working reconnaissance, artillery, and drone coverage over the contested ground. Movement gets expensive for whoever is doing the moving. There's a second problem worth naming. One, ISW itself flags in nearly every assessment. The fog created by competing narratives isn't an accident. Both Russian and Ukrainian channels have reasons to shape the story. One to project unstoppable momentum, the other to project resilience, and neither reason has anything to do with accuracy. ESW's answer is to treat both sets of claims with the same skepticism and hold them to the same geolocation standard before either goes on the map. When a claim can't be verified either way, the report just says so in plain language instead of defaulting to whichever source sounds more confident. Admitting the limit of what's known is, frankly, the most useful thing an outlet covering this war can do. It's the standard this channel tries to hold itself to as well. So where does that leave the picture around Kupiansk as of this assessment? Russian forces are reported applying pressure from multiple directions toward the settlements east and northeast of the city. Ukrainian units are reported to have contested or reversed some of that movement in at least one location within days of the initial claims. The city itself is not reported under direct assault as of May 27th. ESW frames the broader push as part of a sustained campaign along this section of the Kharkiv Oblast front rather than an isolated spike, matching the pattern it's tracked through the preceding months. None of that is a prediction. ESW's assessments document what has happened and what's reportedly happening. They don't forecast what will. Would you have guessed, before this video, that a report using words like renewed push was actually describing a fight for a ring of villages rather than the city itself? That gap between headline phrasing and underlying detail is exactly why primary sources matter more than summaries, including this one. One more thing worth pausing on. The human cost this kind of grinding, settlement-by-settlement fighting represents on both sides. ISW's reporting, in this video, focuses on positions rather than casualties, mostly because verified casualty figures for a specific stretch of front line essentially don't exist in open-source reporting with any reliability. Treat any number attached to a report like this, from either side, as a claim rather than a count. If you want to go past this summary, ISW publishes its full assessments, including the control of terrain maps referenced here, free on its own website, updated daily. Reuters and ISW's public materials are a reasonable starting point if you want to track this axis of the front yourself instead of relying on any single video, including this one, to keep you current. We didn't include every settlement named in the full assessment here, mostly because reading a full gazetteer aloud makes for a rough listen. If you want the complete list cross-referenced against the map, say so in the comments, and we'll consider a deeper follow-up on this specific stretch of front line. So, the honest takeaway. Kupiansk in late May 2026 was, according to ISW, a city under renewed but not yet decisive pressure, contested ground around it, an intact defensive position at its edge, and a lot of claims from both sides that hadn't yet resolved into confirmed fact. That's not a dramatic ending, and it isn't meant to be. It's what the actual, sourced picture of a modern attritional front usually looks like. Slower, murkier, and more contingent than either side's own messaging suggests. The next assessment will either confirm this push stalled or show it continuing. And that's exactly the kind of update worth checking primary sources for, rather than taking any single video's word on it.